I think that brings us to Belingcat. Belingcat, they were there to do the attribution and on Duma right away. Elliot Higgins was attributing it to the Syrian government. Did Belingcat have a role in the OPCW kind of official report?
So, as you say, Belingcat from the start was blaming Syria and Elliot, to the point where Elliot Higgins even deleted photos he was given by people on the ground in Duma who were involved in staging the incident, I think, because the photos he initially published showed the cylinder that was found on one of the roofs of the two buildings. It was rotated the wrong way. So after they rotated it, he deleted one of the pictures that showed it being deleted the wrong way. And his justification for doing that was he said that he was worried about doxing someone in the photo, but the person you can see in the photo of the cylinder was just their legs. It was just there. It was like someone wearing jeans. So you could see someone in jeans, like just the legs. And Elliot Higgins' explanation for deleting that photo was that he was worried about doxing them when it was impossible to identify someone based on their legs.
Well, then the picture comes back online and the canister is positioned in the way that Elliot Higgins wanted it positioned. Am I right?
Exactly right.
Which raises the question, did he reach out to his man in the white helmets and be like, yo, can you move that 35 degrees to the right? I mean, I'm like only half joking.
Yeah, because the initial position that it was photographed in, it wouldn't make sense for gas to disperse that way. So that's why they had to flip it to make it look more believable. So it speaks to his role in, not just attacking whistleblowers, but participating in a cover-up. And again, the question is, if you recognize the damning evidence that was covered up, which showed that there was no chemical attack in Duma and that this incident was staged, then that raises the question of how these people actually died. And we have no idea how they actually died. But if you are involved in pushing the official narrative, which is now known to be a scam, not just from the what happened inside the scenes where people were filmed dead, but also in the hospital in Duma, which everyone now acknowledges was staged. Riyam Dalati of the BBC acknowledges this. No one tries to defend the hospital scene anymore. So when you have so much staging and so much fraud, it raises the question, how do those people actually die? And those who are attacking the whistleblowers, like Belingcat, are essentially covering that up. And
they're covering up a possible human rights crime.
Absolutely.
That could have been committed by insurgents.
Yeah. I mean, it's possible the Syrian government bombed a building.
Those people, and then their bodies were placed there.
That's possible, right? But certainly by thwarting any inquiry and trying to smear the whistleblowers, you're preventing any credible investigation from happening and from finding out what really happened. And so Belingcat, what's funny is they say they're not involved with the OPCW investigation, but a really funny thing happened where for a while in their internal documents, they were saying that we partner with a whole bunch of organizations, including the OPCW. Okay, that was in their internal documents. Then the OPCW leaks emerged showing a major cover-up. And a few months later, Elliot Higgins deleted the reference to the OPCW from those internal documents, and he claimed that it was just a copy and paste error. That actually, it's not true that we're partnering with the OPCW. That was just a copy and paste error. Except the only name that was deleted from that list of organizations that Belingcat partners with was the OPCW. So somehow, in a long list of organizations, it was just a copy and paste error that the OPCW ended up on that list of groups that Belingcat partners with. So I do think that when the OPCW claims that it consulted with outside experts, I do think Belingcat is used for that purpose. And Belingcat was absolutely used to launder disinformation about the whistleblowers when, as I mentioned earlier, Belingcat in the fall of 2020 published this document that it said was a letter sent to one of the OPCW whistleblowers, and they claimed it disproved all of the whistleblowers' claims. We exposed that that letter was essentially a fraud because it never was actually sent. It was a draft letter, and when you look at its contents, they don't refute anything at all.
We're going too far down. I mean, we're going down the rabbit hole a little bit, and these are details that relate to the wider narrative on Belingcat, which is that it's intel by proxy, as Paul Mason put it.
Yes,
and it's involved in everything in doing kind of the OSINT open source investigations, posing as this just collective of independent journalists. So they were, immediately called in on Skripal to identify the two Russians who are said to be responsible for poisoning Sergei Skripal, who was the kind of turncoat former Russian spy who was given asylum and citizenship in the UK along with his daughter. I think he was a citizen. No need to go too much into the details, except that, supposedly he was hit with Novichok, which only the Soviet Union made, for some reason, not far from Porton Down. All kinds of weird details. His handler, Pablo Miller, was an associate at Orbis Intelligence with Christopher Steele. His name was put on a D notice, which meant no British media could report on it. We don't know where the Skripals are. They're completely missing. I would love to see them appear at the Grammys with Zelensky next year if he hasn't been cooed out yet. Looks like that's taking place. But anyway, Belingcat gets the passports somehow of these two Russian guys who came in there suspiciously to Salisbury and said they were just there to go on, for tourism and look at swans. How did Belingcat get those passports? I mean, there are so many, I don't know what you want to call it, like gray spots in Bellingcat's work that show that it's not just an open source intelligence group for the people. And it is I think it's the most celebrated media organization in the West. I mean, no one does documentaries like the New York Times is the greatest paper. But Bellingcat, it's like every year they're the subject of 3 documentaries. They get 15 awards from press organizations run by some reclusive oligarch in the Netherlands. And they get, they're just featured in a 60 Minutes special. I mean, is it fair to say they're the most celebrated media outfit in the West?
Yes, and certainly the most whitewashed because nobody ever acknowledges who funds them, which is the U.S. government and various Western cutouts and spook firms that profit off of the Syria dirty war. They actually recently published the first time. For years, it's been secret how much they get from the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the U.S. government's regime change arm. They've kept that totally secret. Yeah. If you tried to search for it on the NED database, Bellingcat wouldn't even come up. But Bellingcat finally acknowledged it, and the NED is their top funder.
Yeah. I'll throw that up on screen. I just tweeted this out in response to, you can't see it because Paul Mason just blocked me, but his tweet was talking about how Bellingcat is 100% independent and he loves them for all the help they provided. He's trying to clean up the mess he created by calling them Intel by proxy. And here's Bellingcat's financials. National Endowment for Democracy gave them $212,000 in 2021. The National Endowment for Democracy is the regime change arm of the U.S. government, has been involved in fomenting coup attempts from Venezuela to Nicaragua to Hong Kong to pretty much anywhere there's a color revolution. They helped even fix the election or meddled in the election in Mongolia. They're everywhere. They're 100% funded by the U.S. government. Vovan and Lexis, the Russian pranksters who were just removed from YouTube because they embarrassed too many public officials, they got them Carl Gershman, longtime NED director, on the line, and he admitted that he has a network of activists in Russia that he can activate to assist Belarus. They're posing as Svetlana Tikhonovskaya, the Belarusian version of Juan Guaido, who's been sponsored by NED, and posing as her advisor. And said, we're ready to assist you. We have a network of activists. So they're just a straight up arm of the CIA. They were spun out of the CIA in the Reagan administration, and they're the top funder of Bellingcat. And it never gets mentioned, as you said, Aaron.
Never. And Max, I have another screenshot here if you want to add it. That's from so-called nonprofit foundations. And then this is some of their private company funding. And on that list, and Kit Klarenberg has a great article on this up at the Gray Zone from a few months ago. So on the list includes Adam Smith International and Chemonics. And these firms, you might know Adam Smith International because that's a firm that came to fame during the Iraq War when they were heavily involved in the Bush administration's plans to remake Iraq into a neoliberal paradise. And I believe they're also involved in Afghanistan too. So they're basically war profiteers, along with Chemonics as well, a firm that does similar kind of operations. And Zinc Network, that is essentially, that's also that's a British state cutout, right? Zinc.
Yep, it's an intelligence cutout.
Yeah.
They sponsor, like in Syria, they set up the AstroTurf media organizations to push the armed opposition's narrative.
Yeah. So that's who's funding Belingcat. It's U.S. government organizations directly, other Western state cutouts, and then companies that profit off of these same government's dirty wars abroad. That is who's supporting Belingcat. And that never, ever gets mentioned in media. They're supposed to be portrayed as this scrappy group of upstarts who just love to use Google images and other data to uncover war crimes. And really, they're just doing the bidding of the people who pay them.
Yeah. I want to kind of go into their origins a little bit. Bellingcat has such a bizarre story, and it's been clear from the beginning. And I kind of went into the early days of Elliot Higgins, and it tells you why, for example, foreign policy says Bellingcat says what U.S. intelligence can't, and that CIA officers say they love what Bellingcat does. But this is like a limited hangout here. This is them saying, oh, we just love what they do because we can't openly do it, as if they're not instrumentalizing Bellingcat in any way or coordinating with them. But you look back at Bellingcat's history, and it goes back to Elliot Higgins' days. He was a gamer, right? And he was known as Brown Moses. And he pretends to be like this stay-at-home Mr. Mom who stumbled onto these international intrigues because he was just a master of Google Earth. And he's surrounded by just these maverick data disruptors who have this hunger for the truth and an uncanny ability to find it with just a few keystrokes. And he gets puffed by the New York Times, Washington Post, New York Review of Books. There's this Dutch documentary about Bellingcat, which portrays them as just like these grassroots heroes. Claire Wardle, she's one of these disinformation figures from First Draft Media, which is a Pierre Omidyar operation that works with Bellingcat, and Omidyar has sponsored Bellingcat too. The Intercept had a series of $5,000 per person training sessions with Bellingcat, which was a backdoor way of paying them, and they cite them all the time at the Intercept. Claire Wardle said this in the documentary, this Dutch documentary about Bellingcat: we need professional experts like Bellingcat who can help audiences navigate this information space. Do we? The reality is that, as Joe Loria recently wrote in Consortium News, Bellingcat was being pushed by the British Foreign Office through its ambassador at the UN. Ever since 2013, when Joe Loria was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal covering the UN, he said that Mark Liel Grant, who was then the British ambassador, would go in and tell all the correspondents to follow this Brown Moses character. And he thought it was so strange that the British state was pushing an anonymous blog. He said, they're promoting him as this great source. And the ambassador kept praising this guy, but he was anonymous and no one knew who he was. It turns out he was sitting in a basement in like Leicester, England or somewhere with no weapons background at all. And it was just completely weird. Then comes out as Elliot Higgins, comes out from behind the curtain and starts getting promoted by Brian Whitaker, who we all know is one of the top attack dogs against the OPCW whistleblowers. Scott Lucas at the University of Birmingham, another part of this network pushing the Syrian dirty war from within universities, would rely on Higgins constantly to counter any critical reporting of the regime change war. And early 2013, around this time, when Higgins was getting all this promotion, he couldn't find work, he said. So he was working, and this is according to the New Yorker, with Alan Vanguard. You just go online and look up what Alan Vanguard was. He was a consultant. It's a Canadian private intelligence company that gets government contracts to market counterintelligence or countermeasures to militaries seeking protection from drone attacks and IEDs. So this is early on who Higgins was working with. And so somehow to get Higgins, to save him when he started like whining in the media about how he couldn't get any work, BBC World Affairs producer named Stuart Hughes magically materializes and produces a professionally done fundraising video for Higgins from the BBC, which gets its funding for its world service from the British Foreign Office, the public state broadcaster. And then in November 2013, the New Yorker comes out with a series, one of many puff profiles on Higgins. I can put it on screen here. And I'll tell you what's significant about it. And they call him Rocket Man, like he's just this quirky nerd how an unemployed blogger confirmed. No, I don't want your offer. You suck. How an unemployed blogger confirmed that Syria had used chemical weapons. This is all related to the first claims about Ghouta, which you've effectively raked over the coals, Aaron. And, what's significant about this piece is who's quoted in it to testify to Higgins' brilliance. Okay. Gushing praise from Reza Afshar, who is the former Syria team leader for the British Foreign Office. They keep coming up whenever Belingcat is involved. Jeffrey White from WINEP, the Washington Institute for Near East Studies, for Near East Policy, which is a think tank that was cut out of AIPAC, the main arm of the Israel lobby in Washington. And then Yasmin Green from Google Ideas, which is now known as Jigsaw. And she was their main cybersecurity director. And then, of course, you have Human Rights Watch, which is, completely co-opted. And according to WINEP's Jeffrey White, Higgins was basically the standard. What he was doing is basically for the standard for what's going on now in weaponry. And what they mean is information weaponry, not actually weapons analysis, because his analysis was so badly flawed. Now, here's one aspect of Higgins at the time that I think is very few people know about, and it's just shocking to me. Aaron, you had something you wanted to add to this stream.
Okay. So that subheading of that story speaks to something that's so funny. First of all, it's called in the New Yorker. It said something like how an unemployed blogger exposed Syria's use of chemical weapons. That's the essence of what it said, right?
Yeah.
So, which is just a funny line to begin with, like the idea that an unemployed blogger could expose something like that. But it's all the more funny given who he's tried to discredit. And that includes Seymour Hersh, legendary reporter, who's broken some of the biggest stories of the last century. My Lai. He's broken stuff about COINTELPRO, Abu Ghraib, on and on and on. Okay. And so Cy Hersh also reported on Ghouta, where he reported that Obama was privately warned by James Clapper that the U.S. did not have the intelligence that Syria was guilty of the Ghouta attack.
Not a slam dunk.
It was not a slam dunk. That's what Obama was told. And Cy Hersh also reported that tests were done by Portendown, a British military lab, and they found that the sarin found in Ghouta was not a match to the Syrian military stockpile. So, and Hersh also reported on findings by Ted Postel, eminent physicist from MIT, that the range of the rockets that hit Ghouta could, based on the range, they could not have come from Syrian government territory. They only could have come from insurgent-controlled territory. And Elliot Higgins tried to disprove all of this on his blog, and this is what he says about Hersh in his book. He says this: the Hersh story posed many questions. The problem was I had answered most of them long before. And he goes on to say, Hersh needed only to read my blog. Okay. So just like the hubris of this guy, okay, he's a blogger thinking that somehow his blog can disprove not only the reporting of a legend like Cy Hersh, but also the studies that were done by people like Ted Postel, who found that what Higgins put out, basically saying the rockets had to have come from the government-controlled areas, was false, and that the rockets actually only could have come from the insurgent-controlled areas. And even the New York Times was actually forced to recognize this. They essentially retracted stories that they had done based on Higgins' work and Human Rights Watch's work, and they acknowledged that what Postal put out was actually correct. But just like how cocky he is that Seymour Hersh only needed to read my blog, as if that could somehow answer anything.
Yeah, yeah, and it speaks to the sloppiness and unprofessionalism that has marked this career. Back in 2013, we know that Higgins was in touch with someone named Matthew Van Dyke. Matthew Van Dyke is a self-described Christian mercenary who has been active in war zones from Libya to Syria, and around the world. And he runs this hustle where people pay him to like raise private armies to fight fights. And somehow when he was captured, I believe in Syria, his family claimed that he was he was held by Libyan government forces in 2011. And he was running around there with two characters, Steven Sotloff and who's the other one who was beheaded by ISIS, who became like this major figure triggering the attack on ISIS.
James Foley.
Yeah. Sorry.
James Foley.
Yeah. He was riding around with them in his Jeep, taking them around Libya. Very suspicious stuff. I'll get more into that. And he was captured by Libyan forces. His family portrayed him as a combatant, as a journalist, when he was in fact a combatant. And even the Columbia Journalism Review weighed in and said, this is actually putting journalists in danger to cast mercenaries as journalists to elicit public sympathy. In any case, Higgins was in touch with this mercenary, possible spook figure who was involved in so many regime change efforts back in 2013. And something called the Syrian Electronic Army managed to get their communications. I think it must have been because they fished Van Dyke on Facebook, and these were Facebook chats. And basically, at one point, what takes place is that Van Dyke he's been embedded with Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the Syrian wing of Al-Qaeda. And he starts telling his pals that Jabhat al-Nusra has sarin, that they have chemical weapons. This is before the Ghouta attack. Let's take a look. These are some of the chats that I tweeted at Higgins because he was like attacking me for going on CGTN, the Chinese state network that like all kinds of think tankers go on there, but he thought, it was evil that I went on there. And I said, now that he's here, what's up with these 2013 chats between him and mercenary spook Van Dyke? Why did he agree to keep his pal's disclosure about Nusra's sarin off the record? I'll assume these are authentic until he says otherwise. He didn't say otherwise. He said nothing. Let's look at these chats. This is so shocking. Van Dyke to Higgins: don't rule out the possibility that the rebels do have a small quantity of chemical weapons. I've had information for a few months on this. This is off the record. I am telling you, since you've done so much good work in this field, you have a right to know about the likelihood. And then Higgins agrees to keep off the record that an inside source who's been embedded with those rebels has chemical weapons right before a chemical weapons attack that takes place in rebel-held territory that he is reporting or analyzing.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And this is, let me just.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Sorry, a lot of sirens today around me. Yeah, and this is the reality that Elliot Higgins has helped to cover up, which is he knows that insurgents in Syria, supported by the West, have chemical weapons. And that's actually among the revelations that came out in Seymour Hersh's reporting, that there was Pentagon documents extensively about how Al-Qaeda in Syria had an extensive sarin production cell, sarin which was used in the Ghouta attack in 2013. And all that was known. It was discussed. It was heavily circulated inside the intelligence community. Everybody knew it, but everybody covered it up because they wanted to blame the Syrian government, even though they knew the Syrian government had no incentive to use chemical weapons. The only incentive to use chemical weapons came when Obama laid down the red line and said, this is the one condition under which I would launch a military strike. So as a former U.S. Middle East ambassador told Charles Glass of Harper's Magazine a few years ago, the red flag was an open invitation. Sorry, the red line was an open invitation to a false flag.
Yeah, that's such a key quote. Basically, you're incentivizing a false flag attack. Now, here's May 8th, 2013. I don't have this to put on screen right now, but I'll just read some highlights of it. Matthew Van Dyke, mercenary, apparent spook, to Elliot Higgins. I mean, I just can't believe this stuff. Higgins had already agreed to a code of omerta to silence about the armed opposition possessing chemical weapons. And then Van Dyke says to him, I'm just telling you so that you'll keep an open mind about these incidents and not have anything come totally unexpected to you in the future about chemical weapons use in Syria. So he's basically saying there's going to be a chemical weapons attack, and keep an open mind because it could come from the rebels themselves. And then Higgins says, I'll keep an eye out then. Van Dyke, you didn't hear any of this from me. Okay, understood, says Higgins. Okay. I'm not going to let that. I'm not going to let that. I'm not even going to talk about it on background. And then Van Dyke says, you can privately discuss it with other journalists, I suppose, and tell them what I told you. And he says, I'm just telling journalists so they're prepared for the possibility of gas exposure if they work in the Aleppo area, which is controlled then by Nusra. So foreshadowing chemical attacks, Higgins knows all about it, agrees to silence, and goes forward and on every major chemical incident, points the finger at the Syrian government to stimulate public support for regime change over the red line. I mean, I should these have been tweeted about, reported at the time, but I think they're so relevant right now that Belingcat has become what it is, which is just like this major juggernaut, quote unquote, intel by proxy.